Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu Blume.
And I'm Scott McCandless. It is the week of December 4th, and this is your Monday briefing. Congress is in session this week, with just 2 weeks remaining before its scheduled adjournment for the year. Of note this week, the Supreme Court will hear oral arguments in Moore v. United States, which deals with the constitutionality of the mandatory repatriation tax. Sindhu?
Thanks, Scott. We're also waiting for Pillar 2 guidance from the OECD, which last we heard is expected before the end of the year. And it's possible we may see the foreign tax credit regulations by year's end. And here in Washington, we have much to talk about today. And joining us to break it all down is Rohit Kumar. Rohit, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So let's get right into it. There is a call on Capitol Hill for legislative action before the end of the year on 3 TCJA business tax provisions, as well as talks underway for bipartisan agreement between the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee, the leadership and staff. So this is the R&D expensing provision, full capital expensing, and interest deductibility. So what is it going to take for these provisions or for this package to make it by the end of the year?
Yeah, so 2 things need to happen. First, they actually have to have a substantive agreement. And the TCJA provisions, the 3 TCJA provisions are basically, those are pretty easy. Those are just date change. We're not making big policy changes and extending the relief through the end of 2025 to line it up with the fiscal cliff. And that will cost the federal government about $47-ish billion over the next 10 years. Paired with that, under discussion now, is an expansion of the child tax credit that will total roughly the same amount of money. They sort of, there's not going to be strict dollar for dollar equality, but ballpark dollar for dollar equality. That one's a little bit trickier because there are just a lot of levers and dials you can turn inside the child tax credit to expand the benefit. Republicans have some red lines that they made clear at the outset. There has to be some sort of work requirement. There can't be full refundability, in excess of liability. Partial refundability, yes. In fact, the credit is already, this may be a surprise to even some Republicans, it is already 75% refundable. You can get up to $1,600, even if you don't have $1,600 of tax liability. But can you go north of $1,600, but maybe not all the way to $2,000, which is the full amount of the credit?
Sure.
Do we index it for inflation? Inflation in 2017 wasn't such a big deal. It's obviously a much bigger deal now. So those are the sorts of things. So they need a substantive agreement. But then equally importantly, and I think a little bit more vexingly at the moment, is a vehicle. Something to get this thing across the finish line, because we don't have a lot of recent history of moving extender packages as freestanding exercises. In fact, freestanding tax bills tend to be big things like COVID relief packages or Affordable Care Act or TCJA, like big tax bills move freestanding under reconciliation. And so the question is, how's this going to get across, even if you have a deal, how's it get across the finish line? How does it get to the president's desk for signature? Is it on an FAA bill? Is it the Taiwan tax agreement? Is it the National Security Supplemental, which is sort of balled up with border security negotiations? So deal and vehicle. And frankly, if there's no obvious vehicle, they may not actually cement the deal, because at some level, I think there will be some concern about, will we announce an agreement? It's bipartisan, it's compromise. Some things that people want in are not in. Some things that people wanted out are in, vice versa. And if you just let that sit out there for 4, 6, 8 weeks, does it sort of collapse of its own weight because it's just been sitting out there and people on the right and the left kind of pick at it? So it's a complicated dance of striking the agreement close enough to a vehicle that you have time to socialize it, but not so far in advance of the vehicle that it gets socialized and then dies before it has a chance to get signed into law.
Rohit, you mentioned the Taiwan tax bill, which actually passed the Ways and Means Committee last week unanimously, and kind of a nice rare bit of bipartisanship. Can you talk a little bit about its substance, any timing that might be driving its consideration, and whether that could be a vehicle?
Yeah, so as a substantive matter here, there's sort of 2 pieces to the Taiwan tax agreement. There are the changes to the tax code, which the tax writing committees can do on their own. And then there are things that you would normally do more by treaty. We can't actually have a treaty with Taiwan. We don't have diplomatic relations with them, but a sort of treaty-esque arrangement that would include things like dispute resolution, which you can't do through the tax code. So this does sort of 2 things. It is the tax changes being sort of implemented immediately, and then sort of a mandate to the administration, go negotiate the rest of the things that you would normally do by tax treaty, and come back to us and give us something to consider. So if this were a meal, think of the tax changes as like not the full meal. These are like heavy appetizers, right? It's not going to get you all the way there, but it's going to tide you over for a little while. This one does have a temporal sensitivity to it, which frankly I had not appreciated until quite recently, which is there are presidential elections in Taiwan in January, and there is a bipartisan desire to deliver a win. I don't think that this has been stated publicly, but this is my sense of what's going on. There's a bipartisan desire to deliver a win for the current ruling party coalition in Taiwan, and this is sort of seen as a part of delivering a win. We talked about the National Security Supplemental. I mentioned it in briefing. Were that to come together, and that's still not fully baked, we'd anticipated there'd be some supplemental national security funds for Taiwan as well. That would be the other thing that you can imagine sort of being a political victory for the current ruling party in Taiwan. So this one, it's rare because it's bipartisan, it's bicameral, unanimous support in the Ways and Means Committee. This is not a committee that often acts unanimously. Both House and Senate Finance Committee, Senate Foreign Relations Committee have worked out their sort of jurisdictional issues. And so this could be a vehicle for something on TCJA, child tax credit. This could be attached to the National Security Supplemental if it comes together, because we anticipate some Taiwan money in there. Indeed, the National Security Supplemental, with its Taiwan money, could attract a Taiwan tax agreement, which could attract, if they get there, the broader TCJA child tax credit thing. So that could all be wrapped into one. And that's typically how the Senate would like to do things, because each legislative vehicle brings with its own set of 60-vote hurdles and sometimes multiple 60-vote hurdles. And so when I was in a leader's office, we always thought of like legislative efficiency, as in, can't we do all this as one bill? So it's one cloture vote, not a dozen cloture votes. So we'll see. Again, there's a lot of, it's December and there's still a lot of questions to be answered, and 2 to at most maybe 3 weeks left before the Congress is like, see you next year.
Right. So let's say that the TCJA extenders and the Taiwan bill doesn't happen before the end of the year. What are the prospects for that in 2024?
Well, there's certainly this January 19th government funding deadline where we have these laddered CRs. So we have January 19th is the first deadline, then February 2nd, a couple weeks later, is the second deadline. There's already been some discussion of, well, maybe if we strike the agreement, or we're very, very close and we know where it's going to land, but we don't want to do it and let it sit out there, that we wait until January and try to attach it to the January 19th government funding bill. So that certainly, I would never say never to that. It would be unprecedented, the degree of retroactivity, 24 and a half months if we're doing seamless retroactivity. But remember, in 2019, Congress did a 23 and a half month retroactive extension of several provisions, like 20 to 25 different tax provisions. So this wouldn't be a dramatic increase in the degree of retroactivity. I did the math. It's about 4% more retroactive than the 2019 bill. So you would never say never, but it is, we're breaking new ground here if we do it that way. And I never tell anybody to plan their life around something happening that has never, ever happened before, even though it might happen this time. The other variable, of course, is the National Security Supplemental. If that doesn't get done in 2023, and I just don't have a good way of handicapping that at the moment, then that will also become another very urgent must do, must pass kind of thing in early January. So again, all this sort of appropriation stuff could end up attracting a much larger package to include tax.
Right.
Finally, Rohit, with all this uncertainty, what are you recommending that companies should do in this?
The absolute key right now is for companies to express a point of view on this, right? If this matters to you, if you care about 174 expensing or 163J EBITDA versus EBIT limitations or full expensing and the like, you have to let that be known. That's not to say that the business community can make this happen, but what I do know for sure is that the business community stops talking about it, stops talking to members of Congress and their staffs about it, then it definitely will not happen, right? We've only gotten this far because the business community had a robust sort of point of view on the bad result that would happen if these things didn't get addressed. That's the only reason we've gotten as far as we've gone. There's still more ground to cover, but pulling up now and saying, okay, we're done, we're not going to talk about it anymore, is a guaranteed failure.
Makes sense, Rohit. Thank you very much for being with us and for all your insights as always.
Good to be back.
And for our viewers, you'll find a link to the latest Week in Review with Janice Mays, as well as a special episode with Ken Kuykendall in the description of this episode. Stay tuned for another Week in Review coming this Friday.
And thank you as always for spending this time with us. Stay with Policy on Demand for the latest developments from Washington and around the world. Take care.